At age 85, I tend to look back more than I look forward. I think most people do it around my age. And driving up here this morning, a 2-hour drive, I couldn't help but wonder, how did I get here this morning? What forces molded me to be able to speak to you about Old Southern apples? And in my 2-hour drive, I decided there were 3 things that influenced my life and ended up with me standing here this morning. The first thing is my love of science. And I can trace that back exactly to my 10th grade biology teacher, Miss Claire Freeman. And she opened my eyes to the wonders of science, and particularly biological science. And I've never lost that wonder. I've never lost the feeling that first and foremost, I am a scientist. I have 2 degrees in science, but even more than that, I have this giant question mark in my brain. I'm always asking why. Why is that like that? Why have people done things that way? And so science is the first big influence on my life. The second influence is the fact that I was a professional soldier for 23 years. And the Army, what can I say? There's good parts and there's bad parts. But it does one thing for you if you are dedicated to a military career, and that is it gives you discipline. Discipline. It makes you unafraid because you've been through so much that you are not afraid to take on more. And you do it believing that you can succeed. So that's the second thing that influenced me. The third thing that influenced my life was my wife, Edith. We got together my freshman year in college, and we were together for 56 years, and she brought to my life that thing that we all look for, and that's happiness. Couldn't have done it without her. She encouraged me, she stood by me, she criticized me when I needed criticizing, and the book would never have come out if it hadn't been for her, because she was an essential part of this whole thing. So that, I hope you all just take that as background material and understand where I'm coming from. My this whole interest in Old Southern apples got started because I wanted to have a few apple trees in the backyard. And it's strange how serendipity can influence your life. For example, when I was registering at NC State as a freshman, you had to go around the auditorium and you had to sign up for different classes. And I was just stumbling around trying to figure out things as a brand new freshman. And way down at the end of the gymnasium were two desks. And at each desk there was a line, one short line and one long line at each desk. I stopped an upperclassman. I said, "What are those 2 desks down there?" And he said, "Well, the long line is the Air Force ROTC. And the short line is the Army ROTC." And he said, 2 years of ROTC is required, so you got to go down there and sign up. And I looked down there. I was no fool. I went and got in the short line. And I ended up 23 years as a soldier because I got in the short line. And there were some times when I really regretted that decision. And here I was. I just wanted some apple trees for the backyard. And being a history buff, and always being interested in history, and having talked to some elderly rural people in my area, because where I built my house is in a rural area, I wanted to have some of the, what they call the old-timey apples that they had, or their parents had, or their grandparents had, but which had disappeared. And so I said, well, if I'm going to have some apple trees in the backyard, I want some of those old-timey apples. But I couldn't find them. I wrote to a whole bunch of nurseries, got their catalogs, and nobody sold Magnum Bonum, nobody sold Black Twig, nobody sold Yellow Transparent or Red June. So what to do? So I figured, well, if I can find an old tree still alive, I can cut some twigs off of it and graft those twigs and make myself a new tree. And so the key was finding some old trees. So I got in my car, started driving around in Chatham County and on the back roads, dirt roads, looking for old apple trees and finding them. And stop and ask, what kind of tree is that? And they would say, well, we don't know. Granny knew, but she died 3 years ago when nobody paid any attention. Or we don't know, the trees were here when we bought the place. But sometimes an elderly man or an elderly woman would come to the door and say, oh yeah, that's a summer orange apple that my daddy planted in 1910. And if they would put a name on the tree, that sort of excited me, made me think maybe that's an apple I ought to have in my backyard. So I'd cut twigs off of it in the wintertime and graft it. Well, to cut through to the chase here, I kept looking and I kept finding. And this was an open-ended thing. I had no earthly idea how many old Southern apples were out there. My first idea was maybe 10 or 12. And then I kept finding them. I found 30 and then 40 and 50. And I had to get the chainsaw out, clear some more land to plant trees in my backyard. My backyard dwarfed my regular yard eventually with all these apple trees back there. And my son and I got the chainsaw out a couple of other times, cut down some trees, cleared some land. Eventually, I ended up finding well over 400 old Southern apple varieties. So, okay, you find an apple, and it's just a name. You don't have any context to go with it. So in addition to looking for the physical trees, Edith and I started looking for information about these old apples. And there was no single place to go. There was no book we could go to and it was laid out for us. Nobody had ever written about old Southern apples. There was a good book, a 2-volume book, The Apples of New York, published in 1905. So if you were after New England or New York or Northern apples, it was all in there. A wonderful book. But if you were after Southern apples, you were up the creek. There was no place to go for a single source of information. So Edith and I started looking for what we could find. We started going to universities and colleges, going into their stacks, their library, searching for whatever they had. Old books, old nursery catalogs, whatever. And we found some. We went to Duke, we went to UNC, we went to Clemson, went to VPI, went to the University of Virginia, went all over. And we started finding some information, dibs and dabs, not a lot, but something. And then someone told us about the National Agricultural Library in Beltsville, Maryland. And maybe if you get a chance to go to Washington, you ought to go out there. It's amazing. In that area, Beltsville, Maryland, there's a lot of cornfields. And right up in one of these cornfields is a 14-story building just sticking up. And this is the National Agricultural Library. And it is an amazing place. If you can imagine 14 stories about American agriculture. So Edith and I went there, and there we found, the mother lode, and we made copies. We brought them home, made copies at home. We filed it and put it in scrapbooks and put it in notebooks and cross-referenced it. And we did this for 6 years. And then Edith said one day, you know, you got enough information here to write a book. And by God, as usual, she was right. And so I sat down with a pencil and paper and started writing. I usually got up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I would write to 8 because the telephone wasn't ringing and it was too dark to work outside. So I would just write for 4 hours. Then I'd give it to Edith. She'd put it in her computer. She'd print it out, give it back to me. I'd go through it and make corrections, give it back to her, and it would go back and forth 4, 5, 6 times till we got it right. And after 2 years of this, we started looking for a publisher because I had written 220,000 words about old Southern apples. And the first publisher we approached, the University of North Carolina Press, wasn't really interested because most university presses have areas of interest that they're interested in, and this was outside their area of interest. But I found a small publisher in Virginia. I told him what I had, and it was a man and a woman, a man and his wife, a small company, high quality publications. She got in the car, and the next day she showed up at my house. I gave her the whole manuscript, completely done. She said, we will publish this. And they did. Didn't make any changes, none. Didn't ask me to change a word of 220,000 words. And the book came out, and it was very well received. I have to say, it was a good feeling to be reviewed successfully. One reviewer for a gardening magazine called it a masterpiece in our own era. Well, okay, I'll take that. I'll take that. That's one man's opinion, but what the heck. So anyhow, there we are. And I wasn't done yet because I kept collecting information for the next 15 years. And in 2010, I got a call from a publisher in Vermont saying, we want to publish a second edition of your book because the first edition had run out. And the timing was bad because my wife had just been diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. And so I turned to Edith and I said, what do you want to do here? And she said, I've got some time left, let's go for it. So it was actually a godsend because it kept us busy for 8 or 9 months. And we worked really hard to bring the material up to date. And we came out with the second edition of Old Southern Apples in January of 2011. And that's the month that Edith passed away. But she got to see a book before she became comatose. So that was a good thing. So the second edition's out, still available, still being sold. Lisa will sell you one, or Amazon will sell you one. And that's a good thing. When I got a call from Lisa about setting up this Southern Heritage apple orchard, I came up here, I got in the car, came up here right away because I thought it was a good idea. The first time I had approached this site before Lisa came here, I was turned down. Second time, Lisa said, we'll do it. So I came up here, it was a cold March day, it was actually freezing rain and sleet. I came up here, and what I found was a 3 or 4 acre field with an 8-foot deer fence around it, and that's all. No buildings, no well, no trees, no nothing, really. It is just a piece of an old field that had grown up in trees that had been cleared, and they had put a fence around it, and that was what they had. So I tried to figure out what to do. I knew that I needed I had 400 and some odd old apples, trees that I wanted to plant there, and I knew I needed 2 trees of each apple, because if you only got 1 tree and it dies, you're sunk. So you got to have 2 trees to get it back. So I had to find how to do 800 trees of 400 different apples. And I figured it out. I figured 1 tree would be a full dwarf tree trellised on wires. Second tree would be a semi-dwarf tree, freestanding tree, and that's what we ended up with. So that went along for quite a few years. Right now, the orchard is being renovated. Some of those trees are close to 30 years old now, and we've had problems with tree blowdown. The trees have been turned up by high winds, and that's for several reasons. One is I picked a poor rootstock. I picked one called M7A, and I found out the hard way that it doesn't grip the ground as hard as it should. The second reason is there's a hard pan under. This is an old tobacco field. There's a hard pan under the ground, and it blocks the roots from really going deep into the soil. So what we're doing now is taking out these semi-dwarf M7A trees and planting on a rootstock called Bud 9, which is actually a Russian rootstock, but a good one. And we're staking those trees, and we think we'll get around this tree blowdown problem. So what you'll see today is an orchard in flux with some old trees and some new trees, and you'll have to understand that. I'm not a cider man. I'm an old Southern apple man. I didn't, actually in my searches for old apples, the subject of cider seldom came up. And that's because most rural Southerners don't drink alcohol, believe it or not. They don't. There is a strong strain of the temperance movement in the South, particularly in the Baptist and Methodist churches. They are anti-alcohol, and so there are a lot of rural Southerners that simply don't make cider and don't drink alcohol. This is not new. This came about starting in the mid-1800s, when there was sort of a religious fervor that swept the South and saw the rise of the anti-alcohol movement. But there was, in spite of the religious proscription, there was a lot of alcohol made in the South. A lot of it was, corn liquor, and a lot of it was peach and apple brandy, and some of it was hard cider. And so in my book, there's a discussion of cider. A lot of Southerners, rural Southerners, squeezed apples, got the juice out, and they didn't want it to turn hard. They didn't want it to become alcoholic. So they would boil the cider so that it would stay sweet. And so I ran into that several places doing my perambulations looking for old trees. They would talk about cider, but inevitably they were talking about unfermented cider. Of course, there was a few people who really liked hard cider and who made hard cider in the South, and they grew cider apples. And the most, by far, the most important cider apple was the Hughes crab. And most Southerners just talked about crab cider. They were talking about the Hughes crab, cider made from the Hughes crab. If you read biography of George Washington, you'll find that he made arrangements to get crab cider all through the Revolutionary War. Even in the toughest times, he didn't give up his love of crab cider. And of course, Thomas Jefferson was big on hard cider also. So there were Southerners, mainly some who had some money who made carefully made good apple cider, hard cider. Anything else you want me to talk about?
I'm interested, Lee, because your book has such rich detail about the history of some of the apples, and your story of you and Edith going to the library in Maryland.
Yeah.
Maybe if you could talk more about what you found there.
Okay.
And the layers of discovery, because
Sure.
they didn't know what they had.
No, they
really.
didn't. No, they didn't. No. Well, the National Agricultural Library is a 14-story building. The 12th floor, the whole 12th floor, and that's a big area, is what they call special collections. This is their rare books area, rare publications. And it's locked. It's actually a giant cage with locked doors. And Edith and I went up there so many times and worked so many days in the special collections that they just gave us a key and said, don't bother asking us for a key anymore. Here, you can have one. And just turned us loose in there. And that was wonderful. Nobody looking over his shoulder. And here were, priceless books that we could have put in our satchel and carried out the door. It was a magical place. But we found on that 12th floor 200,000 old nursery and seed catalogs dating back to the late 1700s, some of them. And we were looking for the southern catalogs, because these seed catalogs and nursery catalogs were from everywhere, Ohio, Illinois, Massachusetts, everywhere. So we were interested in just the southern catalogs, and the only way we could find them was to open up these dusty old boxes and go through the catalogs one by one. We're talking about 100,000 catalogs here. So that's what we did. And we found 268 old southern nursery catalogs, lots of information about old apples, and a lot of personal information. That such and such apple came from Mr. So-and-so who lives here. So, it gives you more than just a description of the apple. It gives you some background information, which is what we were looking for. So that took a long time, weeks and weeks. We just moved into a motel and just sort of set up housekeeping in there. And then we came to understand that in the 1800s, we tend to think of the 1800s as being, way back there and people sort of scratching for a living. But in the 1800s, there were monthly publications about farming and gardening, just like today, the Southern Living magazine, and there were publications similar in the 1800s, and several of them were Southern publications. The Southern Cultivator came out of South Carolina. The Southern Plantsman came out of Alabama. So, and in these monthly magazines, they would talk about a new apple found by so-and-so and so and give the background and history of it. Damn, that's good information. So we had this giant pile of old magazines that we had to look through and copy. We had to Xerox them or copy them when we found something. And incidentally, we had to go up to the 14th floor to do that, so we were constantly going up and down, up and down. That was a great source of information. Then we found there were all these old agricultural bulletins and publications from agricultural experiment stations, from state colleges, agriculture colleges, going back into the late 1800s, 1870s, 1880s. And they were a gold mine, because most of these colleges and experiment stations set up experimental apple orchards. And they would write about these apple orchards, the apples they had, and how they did in, say, in Alabama or Mississippi or South Carolina. And they would give the background of the fruit. So that was fascinating. Then we we'd been working in this giant room, this cage we'd been working in, and all along one wall were 4-drawer filing cabinets, steel filing cabinets, and we'd actually use those as sort of stand-up desks, and we would stand up and work on top of these filing cabinets. And one day, just for no good reason, I said to Edith, I wonder what's in these filing cabinets. And nobody there had said to us anything about them. And so I picked a drawer at random, and I opened up the drawer, and there were manila folders front to back all the way through the drawer. So I pulled out one of these manila envelopes, and inside was a piece of paper, and I pulled that out, and there was an original hand-painted picture of an apple. And I thought, God, this is fantastic, you know. And so I put that back and went down 4 or 5 filing cabinets, opened up another drawer, pulled out, and there was another apple, and another, and another. And I started asking questions about this, and finally got the information that here were 7,000 paintings of American fruits and nuts, dating back, the earliest one was 1886. And guess who painted most of them? Women. The Department of Agriculture hired women painters, watercolorists, to paint these pictures of American fruits and nuts. And of the 7,000 pictures, 5,000 of them are American apples. So I thought, if, you know, this is, why hide this? Why not let Americans know what a heritage you have in these pictures? The last one was painted about 1930. And why were these pictures painted? They were painted because there was no color photography in those days, and they needed color pictures of apples to help in apple identification. Because people were sending the Department of Agriculture boxes of apples and saying, what kind of apples are these? This tree is growing in my yard and I don't know what kind of apples they are. And they needed pictures in order to help identify these boxes of apples every year. In 1 year, they got 10,000 boxes of fruit, asking what kind of fruit is this? So that collection got a lot of use, but eventually it got stashed and pretty well forgotten. And I ended up in the first edition of this book, I put 48 pictures in there, and in the second edition there's 122 in there. So that's just barely scratching the surface of what's available up there. Incidentally, all the pictures are online now. They're free. You can go online and make a print of any of them. On the first book that were not online, I had to take a commercial photographer up there and photograph each picture individually. So, but
how do you get to the website?
I don't have a computer.
It's in your booklet. It's in there.
In your booklet is a one-page sheet on how to access the Craig and Lee Calhoun archives, which are now at the University of North Carolina. There are 22 boxes of these copies and materials that Lee collected that he's just been talking about. And I thought it might be useful to talk about what became your notebooks and what you found in the basement of the library. Really going back.
Okay, and listen, folks, all of the stuff in relation to the apples are on the right side of the notebook. Left side is Horne Creek.
Diane just reminded me there's one other amazing discovery at the National Agricultural Library. Edith and I were working there one day, and a man came in. He introduced himself, and he said he had been working there for, I think, 20 some odd years. He had already cleaned out his desk. He was getting ready to retire, and he was just sort of walking around saying goodbye to everybody. And he had seen us working there, and he thought he'd just come in and see what's going on here. So we told him we were, looking for information about old southern apples. And he said, well, there is some old filing cabinets down in the sub-basement. He said there are card catalog files. The small wooden files you used to have in the libraries you had to pull out and look through. He said there's a bunch of these card catalog files, a lot of them, down in the sub-basement. They've been moved down there for years. And he said, I think there's something in there about old apples. Maybe you ought to go take a look. So I couldn't find the key. They were locked up. They were in a cage, a wire cage, along with a bunch of other stuff. And I couldn't find the key. It took me 2 days to find who had the key to this cage. And I went in there, and sure enough, there was this long row of card catalogs, hundreds and hundreds of drawers. So I pulled out one, and it was, nothing of interest. Looked like some notes that someone had made about corn 40 or 50 years ago. And I pulled out another one, and it wasn't of much interest. And I went down, pulled out a drawer, and pulled out one of these 3x5 cards that were in there. And on this card was a handwritten information about an old apple. And it described the search for the information about where the apple originated and who originated it and all that. I said, well, that's interesting. That wasn't a southern apple, but it was interesting. So Edith and I started pawing through this drawer and then other drawers next to it. And we found out all these drawers must have been, I would say, 40 to 50 drawers filled with these 3x5 cards, front to back. And these cards gave the results of the Department of Agriculture Division of Pomology, 1886 to roughly 1910, searching for the origins of American fruit. And when they found information, they'd write it on a card and stick it in this file. And we went through all the 40 drawers, and in there was a lot of information about southern apples that they had uncovered, Texas apples, Arkansas apples, Mississippi apples, a lot of information. So it was another gold mine that nobody had ever used before. So all of that stuff that we had found all went into the book. And the book, when I wrote it, I had a target audience in mind because Edith and I had started a small nursery, and we were selling grafted trees of old southern apples. We would graft 1,000 to 2,000 trees a year, and people would all come and get them, and we sold out every year. So the people who were buying our apple trees were rural Southerners. They had the NRA right there on their caps. You're pretty sure where their background was, and when you started talking to them, you realized these were, the salt of the earth Southerners here. And that's who I targeted my book for. It's not that I wrote down to them, because I didn't, but I wrote for them. And I tried to put in the book interesting facts phrased in such a way that they would enjoy reading the book. And I think that's one reason why the book came out as well as it did. I wasn't technical. I wasn't writing beneath them, fourth grade level or sixth grade level. I was writing at senior high school or that level, and it came out really, really well. I can read my own book today and enjoy it. And it's a good book. And I have to say that I'm a one-shot wonder. That's my shot right there, Old Southern Apples. But everything I know is in there. So when my brain gets so scrambled I can't remember my own name, I can go in the book there and find out everything I need to know about old Southern apples. So.
One of the things, one of the quotes I like from you, Lou, that I use a lot is the comment that you made once that we Southerners many Southerners don't know we have our own apples. And we think apples have this narrative that ascribes them to the mountain South only. And one of the things that you speak very powerfully of is that apples were grown all over the South, and also for many uses compared to today where an apple is a snack, and that's kind of about it. So would you talk a little bit about the geographic dispersion of what you learned and the uses too?
Every state in the old Confederacy, and that includes Arkansas and Texas and Maryland and some of the others, every state had apples that originated in that state. Believe it or not, one apple originated in Florida, and it's lost. Can't find it. But it would be good to find, and you don't give up. It may turn up yet. So who knows? Mississippi, Louisiana, like 8 or 10 apples originated in Louisiana. Who would have thought? But it is amazing that so many apples originated in so many different places. Here in North Carolina, we have an apple, a really good apple, that originated in a county that's 10 feet above sea level, Dare County. I mean, it's right on the ocean. And the Madame Mesquite apple is a wonderful apple. I grow it in my orchard, and it's terrific. So apples can grow everywhere. Having said that, I have to be realistic in saying that apples really are not well adapted to the South. They originated in Central Asia on high mountain plateaus, semi-arid areas, and that's what they like. They like warm days and cool nights. Well, in the summertime here in the South, we have hot days and warm nights. And that's not really that good for apples. Having said that, higher altitudes up in the mountains, they do have better weather than that. So, but even with that disability, Southerners have grown apples for 400 years. And because apples were a main part of the Southern diet. They had so many different ways of using apples. And in addition to that, apples were probably the only fruit that could be kept fresh for any length of time in the wintertime. Properly stored, properly picked, properly stored, even in warmer areas, apples would last 2 or 3 or 4 months during the winter. And that was important. Families that were eating dried and pickled foods in the wintertime before canning and freezing. So I tried to get all of that into my book. The book is a good read, but it's crammed full of facts too, and I tried to get all of that in there. Diane?
What were some of the early apples you discovered that have stuck with you?
Oh,
some of the Chatham County,
oh yeah,
the
yeah.
stories behind it that kind of sparked your
Yep.
interest?
Well, we tend to think of apples as an autumn fruit. It's not in the South. You can pick ripe apples in June down here, and ripe apples in July, and in August, and September, and October, even November. So it's a 5-month fruit, really. And this sets the South separate from up north, where it's truly an autumn fruit. They don't have the long spring, warm springs and late autumns that we have down here to allow us to spread out the apple harvest. Some of those early apples are very, very useful. I'm talking about apples that are ripe in June and July. Those are your best sauce apples. If you're making apple sauce, then nothing can beat those early apples. They have a twang and a zest to them that comes through in applesauce. And of course, you have to add a little sugar, but they make the world's best applesauce. I play bocce ball. I got some guys I call my bocce brothers. We play every Tuesday morning. Old guys, mostly old Army, Navy, Marines guys. And I had them out to my house a couple of weeks ago for lunch, all 12 of them. And I served some of my homemade applesauce, which I'd made in last spring and had frozen. And they couldn't get enough of it. I mean, they were bowled over by how delicious it was. So, and it's pink too, because the red June you cook with the peelings on, and it turns the applesauce pink. So, very pretty. And so, they're a little tart. The early apples are a little tart. They'll get mushy fast if you leave them on the tree too long. But if you pick them in time, you can make great stewed apples with them, great applesauce. And you pick them a little green, a little firm, you can make a green apple pie that's out of this world. So, then there's July. And I have two apples that to me are wonderful. And let me say this about the June and July apples. They are the apples that you will pick that are unblemished, absolutely unblemished, because they haven't run that gauntlet of diseases and insects that the October apples have run. And they've been picked on for 5 months. Those early apples, they beat the rush. They come in and come out before the bugs and the diseases get a chance to work on them. So in my July apples, my two favorites are, you have to excuse me, names don't come easy anymore. Let's see. Yeah, Edwards, sorry, not that. I'm sorry, I can't think of them right now, but they're, St. Clair is one of them. St. Clair, there's a big question mark. You read my book, there's a big question mark about that apple. There's a St. Clair County in Alabama, and there's a St. Clair County in Illinois. And which one birthed this particular apple is the question. I think it's an Alabama apple personally, because it's so well adapted to southern growing areas, but it seems like the preponderance of experts think it may be a northern apple. But anyhow, it's a really good apple, gets ripe in July, a fantastic, wonderfully good apple. So anyhow, anything else I ought to touch on?
I think one of the things I learned from you just recently that I had not focused on were kind of the hyper-local apples, family apples, and apples that are you pass on, and apples that require people's names because of that. And I know we have a lot of that in our corner of Virginia. You have a lot of family name apples.
Well, good point, thank you. Edith and I, in our work with apples, we came to realize that we could divvy up apples into sort of 3 categories. The first category was what we call family apples. And these were apples that originated with a southern family as a seedling tree. Seedling tree came up, whether it was planted, seed was planted on purpose, or whether it was just a discarded core that one of the seeds sprouted. But all new apples incidentally have to come up from seeds. You can't get a new apple without growing it from seed. So these trees would come up, and they would have good apples on them, as sometimes happens. Not always for sure. Most seedling trees are pretty lousy, but occasionally you'll find a good one. And that family would name that apple, often with their family name, and they would pass that apple down to daughters when they got married, and on down through the family for 4, 5, 6 generations. And they would do this by digging up root sprouts from the original tree. The original tree is a seedling tree grown from a seed which means the whole tree, the roots, the trunk, the top, and everything, are all the same. So you can, when it sends up a sprout from a root, comes up as a little shoot, you can dig that up and it will be the same as the parent tree. Now you can't do that with a grafted apple because the roots, something else. So they would dig these sprouts up and pass them down, and then the next generation would dig up from their tree, pass them down. Those we call family apples. And I believe that this is pretty much a southern phenomenon here. I don't see this in northern apples, at least nowhere near the degree of pride that southern families took in having their own special apple and nobody else had. Bragging rights, maybe, I don't know. The next group of trees that we found were, I'm sorry, I'm blanking out again here. Let's see. Local apples. These were apples that the apple tree came up, had good apples on it. The neighbor would say, "Wow, you got a good apple there, Sam. How about letting me have a root sprout?" He said, "Okay." And so the root sprouts would get spread out, maybe in a rural community or maybe even a whole county. And you would not find this apple anywhere else but just in this local area. More than one family, many families usually, but nowhere else. And never written about, no publication, nobody picked up on it. It was just a rural community, had their own apples. We found a lot of those too, believe me. And the third category were what we call historical apples. These were apples that we could find written history about in old catalogs, old publications, old agricultural bulletins from that type of thing. So those were called historical apples. If there was any written information, no matter how obscure, and some of these writings were very obscure, like, for example, the Georgia Horticultural Society's meeting in 1877. But it's in print. The minutes were published and were in print. That's a historical apple. So it makes it easier to appreciate these old apples when you ask yourself, where did that originate? Who took care of it? How did it get going? Who spread that apple around and when and where? You start really digging up Southern history here. Because Southern history is wrapped all around these old apples, all around. Just read in the book about what people went through after the Civil War. They wanted an apple tree, they had to barter for it because nobody had any money. So they would bring produce to the nursery and swap their produce for an apple tree. So, a lot of history wrapped around these old apples, and it's all in the book. And with the book, you don't have to worry about me remembering things.
So we might want to transition into Q&A.
I want you to explain one thing to everybody though.
Sure.
One of the primary questions that we get here when people come to visit the apple orchard is, do these apples cross-pollinate? And I'd like you to tell them how we end up getting the same variety of a tree.
Okay. If you look at an apple flower in March or April, you'll see there are male and female parts in the same flower. So there are female sex cells and male sex cells in the same flower. So you say, what's the problem with pollination? You got it all right there in that same flower. I mean, it's like, a 1/16 of an inch between the female and the male sex cells. What's the big deal with pollination? Well, the big deal is apples cannot pollinate themselves. They reject their own pollen. And they reject the pollen from like apples. So one red delicious cannot pollinate another red delicious. So Mother Nature set that up so that there's better genetic spread of useful genes among the pool of apple trees. So apples are cross-pollinated. It takes two different apple trees for pollination purposes. They can swap pollen back and forth. And incidentally, you can pollinate apples with crab apples. And commercial orchards use crab apples for pollination because crab apples have lots of flowers on them, lots of pollen. They make really good pollinators. And they don't have to worry about picking the fruit later. And what they usually do, they'll plant a crab apple between two apple trees, not leaving any room, just sticking it in there, and prune it so it's just goes straight up and very few limbs on it. And that way they don't lose any room in their orchard for pollinators.
Lee, explain what the cross-pollinated part of the apple is.
Okay, all right. Okay, so the apple flower has pollen. Pollen is the male sex cell. And apple pollen is too big, too heavy to be carried by the wind. It's carried from flower to flower by insects, mainly bees. In my own orchard, the primary pollinator is the carpenter bee, the big black bumblebee that bores holes in your house. I like those babies because they're out there working those apple trees all the time. Nobody else out there. And there are those big, heavy bombers out there pollinating my apple trees. They can eat all the holes in my house they want. I don't care. So, you may have honeybees. I have almost none at my house. So, but you got to have pollinators because if something doesn't move that pollen from flower to flower, you're not going to get any apples. So, so you have pollen. That's the male sex cell. At the base of the flower, there's a little bulb, a little bulge at the base of the flower. In that base are the female sex cells, the ovules. And the bee deposits pollen on the flower. The pollen sends a tube down to the base of the flower. And through that tube, the male sex cells go and pollinate the ovule at the base of the flower. Now let's be clear about what's being pollinated here. It's the seeds that are being pollinated, not the flesh of the apple. The flesh of the apple, the part you eat, comes from the mother tree, comes from the tree the apple is hanging on. So Red Delicious trees always have Red Delicious apples on them because the flesh comes from the Red Delicious tree. But the seeds inside are half Red Delicious and half something else because it's cross-pollinated. And so if you plant those seeds, you will not get a Red Delicious apple. You will get a cross, and you don't know where the pollen came from. Could be anything. Could even be a crab apple. So you can plant apple seeds, and if you want to plant them, please do. But be prepared for disappointment because you plant those seeds, a tree will come up, and you wait 4, 5, 6, 7 years for the tree to have apples on it, and the chances are really good that there'll be mediocre to bad apples on it. Is that good enough?
That's good.
So that we maybe have 10 minutes or so of questions and maybe take a break, we'll transition. I would ask that since we're going to have about a 30-minute little panel on cider apples, just hold those questions for the panel, okay?
Yeah. Let me say one other thing. I want to say a few words about rootstock, because apples are a twig's taken from this tree and it's put on this little apple tree, which just the root of a little apple tree. They grow together, the little apple tree and the twig grow together, and a tree grows up from the twig. So whatever the twig is, that's what the new apple tree is going to be. So the root has 3 purposes. One is it holds the tree in the ground. The second thing is that it determines the ultimate size of the tree. So here's the thing, apple roots have been bred, just the roots, not the tree, just the roots have been bred to but to stay small. And small roots make small trees. And apple roots have been bred to make medium-sized trees, and they make a 12-foot tree. And the apple roots have been bred to make a fairly large tree, and that's an 18-foot tree. So you can tailor the size tree you want by choosing the appropriate rootstock. At last count, there were over 50 different apple rootstocks available. There are American rootstocks known as the Geneva rootstocks. There are British rootstocks known as Malling or Merton Malling or MM. There are Polish rootstocks, there are Russian rootstocks, there are French rootstocks, there are German rootstocks. Everybody's gotten in the game here of developing rootstocks, and it's hard to know sometimes which one is appropriate and which one isn't. So you really kind of have to do your homework here if you're serious about grafting apple trees. Any other question? I saw a hand. Yes, ma'am.
When you say small roots, does that mean they go down less deeply? They're not going to hold the tree?
Yes, that's exactly what it means. They don't spread laterally and they don't go as deep as trees on big roots. Yes?
Since we're talking about rootstock, maybe you could just give us some recommendations from Piedmont or what rootstocks would be best for this location.
Well, if you want a small tree, an 8 to 10 foot tree, people now are using Bud 9, which is a Russian rootstock. Bud stands for Budgorsky, who is the developer of that rootstock. And it's a very good rootstock. It's probably the most widely used rootstock in America right now. And most commercial orchards are being planted on Budgorsky 9 rootstock. If you want a semi-dwarf tree, I would plant M7A, which is a good tree, M7A, as long as you have really deep soils that it can grip on. And you might want to look into some of the Geneva rootstocks. They have several that would suit you. For a big tree, I'll always like a MM111, which is an English rootstock, developed in the 1940s, I think, and makes about an 18-foot tree, which is still small, because a standard tree, a tree planted on seedling rootstock, will get 20 to 30 feet tall. That's called a standard tree. Yes, ma'am.
I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on planting with climate change in mind and how we could think about our climate getting warmer and maybe taking some of those trees from warmer states like Alabama and in this area.
Yeah. Well, southern apples in general are better at growing with heat than northern apples are. Yeah. Northern apples do very poorly in the south. They are not equipped for 190 and 100 degree days, and they show their displeasure by apples rotting on the tree, or a lot of different ways, just falling off the tree early and things like that. So when it comes to heat, if you're looking for something that'll do well in the heat, you ought to look among these southern apples, because there are several that grow really well right on the Gulf Coast, where you only have 200 or 300 hours of cold weather in the wintertime. And so it may be, you can do what you want to, but it may be that in 50 years or so, some of these southern apples will be growing in New York and Michigan because they can take the heat. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Is any university doing research on DNA, for apples and, capturing that information so that they can identify a tree for sure?
I don't know. I'll let you.
I can answer that for you.
Yes.
Check out Syracuse University and Cornell. I know it was in the 70s when I took courses there, and I heard people talking about DNA.
Now, whether there's a bank of information that can be used for apple identification, I don't know. It would be good to have it, because apple identification is extremely difficult under the best circumstances.
How do you do it?
I don't. by and large. I depend on the person who I got the apple from originally to tell me what kind of apple it is. And I think that's the strongest way you can identify an apple. I think all other ways are inferior except for maybe DNA, which we don't know about yet. Trying to identify an unknown apple, holding an apple and trying to figure out what kind of apple it is when there are thousands and thousands of apples out there, that's just not going to work. You can say what you want to. There are people that say they can do it, but I have strong problem with that.
Well, for instance, you have the Walker Lake listed in your extinct list. I have one in my orchard that is categorized as a Walker Lake. I will positively identify that it is with no more information than there is on it.
Where did you get your information about the name?
From my grandfather downstairs.
That's good enough. That's a Walker Lake, and we need to grow it and make sure that it matches what we know about that apple. And if it does, that's a Walker Lake. That's how you come up with these old apples. Somebody says, I've got this, I've got that. You have to plant it, you have to grow it, you have to take a look at the fruit and compare with everything you know about that apple in order to say, yeah, that's what it is. Yeah, that's how I did it. Now other people do it other ways, but that's how I did it.
And then how did you come up with, within the book, there's a number of apples that one person calls it this and one person calls it that. Was it by comparing it back to your research at the library?
Yes, that's going back to the original sources. And like a nursery catalog, say 1850 Georgia nursery catalog, will say such and such apple also known as this and this and this. So that's where I get the information from.
In that 14-story archive where there are all these watercolors, how did they handle the request for information? What was their means of controlling how they knew where to go to identify an apple within that array of watercolors?
Well, they were filed alphabetically in the drawers. Started with A over here and ended with Z way down there.
But not organized by color or shape?
No, completely alphabetical. So you had to go through all of them in order to find the southern apples that were in there. You had to go through all the drawers, one at a time. That's how you did it. More questions? Yes, sir.
How many apples since your first edition were listed as extinct have now been found?
About 35 or 40 that were included in the second edition that were listed as extinct in the first edition. And I'm still finding them. I've found 3 in the last 2 years. It's not that I'm out there driving around looking for old apples anymore, because I'm not. But people read my book and they say, he lists the Jersey Sweet as an extinct apple. Well, I got one out here in my backyard, right? And they call me, they write me, and eventually we say, yeah, that's an apple that we list as extinct, and it's not extinct anymore. And I found an apple in Arkansas. I found one, believe it or not, in Michigan that's listed in my book as extinct. It's in 3 trees in an old orchard in Michigan. So you can still find them. It's rare. I go years without finding any now, but you can still do it. So, and my book is responsible, not me personally, but people still reading the book. I got a letter a couple of years ago. It was from Duluth, Minnesota. And I thought, well, what's going on here? A guy's writing me. I opened the letter, and the letter said that he and his wife had a hobby when they were taking their summer vacation of driving around to old orchards and talking to the growers and sampling apples. And he said that we've done that for years. And he said, we were in an orchard in Michigan last year, and they have 3 trees of an apple that you have listed in your book as extinct, the Jersey Sweet. And so I corresponded with the orchard owner, and sure enough, that's what it is. It's amazing to me that it's in Michigan, And this was grown in the South and is listed in my book as extinct. But there's an apple that's turned up, and it's the real McCoy. And it's in an orchard in Michigan. Yes, sir.
On that note, I had orchards up on Lake Ontario in New York State, Central State. And talking to the neighbors that were there before we bought the property, there was I always thought it was a folk tale, but I think now, there were a couple of brother-in-laws during the Civil War that were in the South, and they brought back several apples. This was in Wayne County and around Sodus, New York. And they had names like July Red and Sodus Orange, but I was told that they originally came from the South. And it seems like anybody that grew apples in that county, they had an apple named after.
Right, right. Well, I believe that because apples that grow well in the South grow better in the North because the conditions are better up there. Apples like that colder weather. Apples can take 20 below with no damage, but 100 in the shade, boy, that can hurt an apple tree big time. So you take a southern apple and take it up north and grow it, you're going to get a better apple, you're going to get a healthier apple tree than we can grow down here. So I absolutely believe that. Yes, sir. Thank you. Yes.
Driving around the South when you're doing your research, did you ever come across interesting trees that had multiple fruits on them or multiple varieties?
I did. There were several people who grafted different apples onto the same tree. I've done that. I have 3 trees that are multiple variety trees. One has 8 different apples on it, and one has about 15, and the other one has about 20 apples on it. You can do that when the tree is young because you graft each branch as it comes out. You graft onto that branch so each branch becomes a different apple. Now that's not a good thing to do if you're serious about apples because apples the sign that you graft on there can transmit a virus to the tree and it will infect all the apples on the tree. And I actually did that. I have one tree that's infected with a mosaic virus. It has 12 different apples on it, but I can't graft off of it because I don't want to transmit that disease. So I eat the apples, but I can't graft off of it. So.
Well, Lee's been talking nonstop for a while, and maybe give him and us a break. It's about 25 after. Let's take a 10-minute break and come back, and we'll have a panel up here, and we'll have a 30-minute discussion of more about apples.